We thought that once we reached home, the war would be over, and that, in the worst imaginable case, the army would be reorganized so that no enemy would enter Germany itself. We clung to this final idea as the one justification for our suffering and a way to banish thoughts of suicide, which others had already accepted. Yesterday's Lancer, members of elite units, Panzer Grenadiers who had faced 1,000 deaths to live for a chimera, held on to the belief that we had to live to hope, and we had to hope passionately to be able to live as we were. We had to fight against daily ambushes and keep going no matter what, to escape from the Russians, who were hard on our heels. And we had to eat a certain minimum amount, which wasn't easy to do. There were 12 in our group, many of them familiar companions. Schlesser, Frosch, Lieutenant Wollers, Lenson, Kellerman, and then Hals and me, kept together by a miracle of silent fraternity. Hals, who had grown startlingly thin, was forcing his large, bony body along the narrow mountain road some 4 or 5 yards ahead of me. He often walked ahead of me, which gave me a certain sense of security, although his large body was seriously reduced. He was stripped to the waist, wearing a leather belt and a band of cartridges for the Spandau across his chest. A Russian blouse, in anticipation of the cool evenings at this altitude, floated from the leather pouch that held his few possessions, along with 4 or 5 grenades. His heavy steel helmet seemed to be riveted to his head, and the lice in his filthy hair must have died for lack of light. Many men had thrown away their heavy helmets, but Hals felt his was a last link with the German army, and that during this terrible trial we should try to remain soldiers rather than degenerate into tramps. I kept mine too, as a sign of solidarity, dangling from my belt. Someone up ahead shouted for us to come and see. We looked down into a leafy ravine. A camouflaged truck bearing the inscription WH had crashed to the bottom. Lenson was already running down to have a closer look. "Watch out!" someone shouted. "It might be a trap!" Lieutenant Wollers had joined Lenson. We drew back, certain that the partisans had arranged a booby trap, and that we would see our 2 companions blown to pieces any minute. However, a reassuring shout floated up from the gulf. "A windfall! Mein Gott! It's like a whole commissary!" Within seconds we were all running toward the miracle. "Look at that! Chocolate, cigarettes, Wurst! Good God! And here are 3 bottles too!" "Shut up!" shouted Schlesser, "or you'll have the whole army down here. It's a miracle no one found this before." "So many delicious things," said Frosch in an almost tender voice. "Let's all grab everything we can. We can share it out later, on the road." Frosch and another fellow loaded themselves heavily and climbed back to the road to keep watch. Thousands of men were wandering very close to us. We would try to take everything. We had almost completed the job when our 2 lookouts shouted, "Achtung!" We ran into the brush and heard the distant roar of a motorcycle. The engine slowed down and seemed to stop. We ran off through the thorny growth, clutching our precious cargoes. We were used to getting out of the way in a hurry and melting into the ground when an unfriendly eye might become too interested in our existence. We could hear some non-coms shouting and supposed that our 2 companions had been caught by a military patrol, perhaps even by the military police. "Those 2 sods were caught with bottles under their arms," muttered Wollers. "Let's get out of here as fast as we can," said Lindbergh, who had just run up. "Someone's coming down," whispered Lenson. "An MP. I saw his badge." "Hurry, let's get out of here." Everybody ran, scattering into the bushes as if Ivan himself were at his heels. We regrouped after 500 or 600 yards, hiding behind a rocky outcrop. "I've lost enough breath because of those bastards," said Halls. "If they want to chase us this far, I'll take care of them." "You're crazy," said Lindbergh. "Don't talk like that. What are you trying to do to us?" "Shut up," Hals said. "You'll never make it home anyway. Ivan's going to get you for sure. Why don't you think for a minute of Frosch and the other fellow who've been caught?" "We might as well eat," said Wollers. "I've had enough of giving orders and sweating and shitting in my pants like a baby when I'm scared, so let's get started. If we're going to die for it, all the more reason to fill our bellies while we can." Like hungry beasts, we wolfed down the contents of the tins and other provisions, masticating loudly. "We'd better eat it all," Lenson said. "If we're caught with anything in our sacks that wasn't handed out, we'll be in trouble." "You're right. Let's eat it all. They won't slit us open to see what's inside, although it would be just like those bastards to check our shit." For an hour, we gorged ourselves until we were almost sick. When it grew dark, we returned to the road by a devious route. Lenson stepped out of the brush first. "Come on, the coast is clear." We went on for 300 or 400 yards, passing once again the hole with its unexpected windfall, which had allowed us to fill our famished stomachs for a moment. There was no one in sight. We went on for another 2 or 3 miles and collapsed at the side of the road. "I can't go any further," said Schlesser. "We're not used to eating any more, and this is what happens." "Why don't we go to sleep right here?" someone said. "That will help our digestion." Toward 2 o'clock in the morning, a large group of German soldiers came by and woke us up. "On your feet!" shouted an old Feldwebel. "Get going, or Ivan will be in Berlin before you." We resumed our trek. This bunch had collected several horse-drawn wagons, and for a while we were able to ride. At daybreak, we arrived at a town built on the mountainside. Some men were splashing in an icy bathing place. Others were sleeping on the ground or on terrace walls. Farther on, still others had begun their march again, toward safety, the west, the mother country, waiting to receive them, whose true condition they couldn't begin to guess. And then there was a tree, a majestic tree, whose branches seemed to be supporting the sky. 2 sacks were dangling from those branches, 2 empty scarecrows swinging in the wind, suspended by 2 short lengths of rope. We walked under them and saw the grey, bloodless faces of hanged men, and recognized our wretched friend Frosch and his companion. "Don't worry, Frosch," whispered Hals. "We ate it all." Lindbergh hid his face in his hands and wept. I managed with difficulty to read the message scribbled on the sign tied to Frosch's broken neck. "I am a thief and a traitor to my country." A short way off, some 10 policemen in regulation uniform were standing beside a sidecar and a Volkswagen. As we walked by them, our eyes met theirs. One September morning, we found ourselves in a farmyard somewhere in the south of Poland. The horror of our previous experiences had left us entirely without reaction, and we stared about us with the stunned eyes of someone who has been heavily drugged. A short way off, an officer was shouting something at us, a speech or a report, which fell on deaf ears. We stared at the sky to avoid thinking about the earth, which supported human life. Only an explosion, or perhaps a Feld's whistle, could have dragged us from our lethargy. However, in this district, there was at least a semblance of order, and under cover of this last fragment of organization, we were trying, as best we could, to recover our strength and some sense of morale. The Russian thrust to the south was so strong that we had to consider Romania enemy territory. We would soon be fighting in Hungary too, before Kecskemét, and then in Budapest. The officer went on with his speech, talking about a counter-offensive, regaining control of events, regrouping our troops, even about victory, a word which no longer had any meaning for us. Although we couldn't conceive of the defeat that lay ahead, we understood that victory was not possible. We knew that we would still be obliged to make intense efforts defending some particular organized positions, but we had no doubt that we could stop the enemy before the German frontier. Despite our general unease and near collapse and all our disillusion, we knew that we couldn't simply give up. The looming disaster was inconceivable to us. Even today, survivors of that experience find it difficult to accept all the facts. But despite our unshakable faith, we all felt temporarily unable to continue fighting. Some time off, some rest, was absolutely essential. We were in a state of exhausted collapse, capable of nothing. "General Friesner has re-established the southern front," the officer was shouting. "Our regiments will be reformed and reinforced by substantial reserves. The enemy must not go any further. You will stop him." We were divided into groups, companies and regiments and loaded into trucks. It seemed there was still gas hereabouts. The Gross Deutschland units were sent north, which surprised us, as the rest of the division, or what was left of it, was fighting with Army Group Centre. Some units were already with Army Group North, and the two hard-pressed armies were eventually joined. The trucks took us to a train which was waiting on a single track sheltered by a pine forest. There was no station. We left in a long string of miscellaneous cars. My group was loaded onto an open platform like the one which had taken me out of Poland and into Russia so long ago. Today there was no need to fear any future in Russia. The Germans had been chased from that country. Today we were going north, slowly and carefully, as the track might be mined or the sky full of bombs. The train took us to Lodz, where we saw many astonishing things. We stayed in Lodz for about 30 hours. The front was very close, and like all towns near the fighting, Lodz was full of troops. As in the south, men were being sorted out and regrouped. 30, 40, even 50% of the names on the regimental lists had to be scratched off. In some cases, men already scratched off as dead or missing reappeared from the void. The Gross Deutschland had a rallying point at Lodz, a former candy shop stripped of all its wares, the adjoining room for the concierge, and a long corridor. A large panel correctly painted black on white, and a stylized white helmet, the regimental emblem, hung over the door, which was still intact. 2 sentries in correct uniform were stationed on either side of the door. "Here we are," Lenson said, "back at the Gross Deutschland." For an hour and a half we had been tramping through the city from which nearly all the civilians had gone, looking for this place. Lieutenant Wollers presented the officer at the centre with his list of the men with him, including the numbers of their companies, regiments and groups. There were about 200 of us. "Here is the list of men with me, Herr Hauptmann." "But you're bringing me a bunch of Ruskis, Herr Leutnant," the captain said, looking at our motley collection of clothes. Many of us were wearing padded Russian jackets. "My apologies, Herr Hauptmann. We began to run short of uniforms." "Very short," said the officer, smiling. "I'm going to send you to the store, and you'll see if there's anything left. You'll have to be quick because you won't be here long." In the next street, we found the divisional store, which was still much better stocked than the supply stores of ordinary divisions. Some of our men could be given quite a few of the things they needed. While we waited, we watched a crowd of men, part of a new Volkssturm battalion, swarm into a factory courtyard. When we looked more closely at these men, recently called up by the Führer, our eyes opened wide with surprise. They all belonged to the last class of reserves, and seemed to be an even more extreme case than the Marie-Louise conscripts at the end of the Napoleonic era. Some of these troops with Mausers on their shoulders must have been at least 60 or 65, to judge by their curved spines, bowed legs, and abundant wrinkles. But the young boys were even more astonishing. For us, who had saved our 18, 19, and 20-year-old lives through 1,000 perils, the idea of youth meant childhood and not adolescence, which was still our phase of life, despite our disillusion. But now we were looking literally at children, marching beside these feeble old men. The oldest boys were about 16, but there were others who could not have been more than 13. They had been hastily dressed in worn uniforms cut for men, and were carrying guns that were often as big as they were. They looked both comic and horrifying, and their eyes were filled with unease, like the eyes of children at the reopening of school. Not one of them could have imagined the impossible ordeal which lay ahead. Some of them were laughing and roughhousing, forgetting the military discipline which was inassimilable at their age, and to which they had been exposed for barely 3 weeks. We noticed some heart-wringing details about these children, who were beginning the first act of their tragedy. Several of them were carrying school satchels their mothers had packed with extra food and clothes instead of schoolbooks. A few of the boys were trading the saccharin candies, which the ration allotted to children under 13. The old men marching beside these young sprouts stared at them with incomprehension. What would be done with these troops? Where were they expected to perform? There was no answer to these questions. Were the authorities going to try to stop the Red Army with them? The comparison seemed tragic and ludicrous. Would total war devour these children? Was Germany heroic or insane? Who would ever be able to judge this absolute sacrifice? We stood in profound silence, watching and listening to the final moments of this first adolescence. There was nothing else we could do. Some hours later, we were driven to a new assembly area a few miles from the Vistula, in a town called Medau. There we found a large part of our full division, which had left us in the south long ago. Even our regiment was there, and its officers, with their familiar names. The auxiliary services of our autonomous unit had performed enormous feats of imagination to continue functioning. We were extremely surprised to find that the full Grossdeutschland division was still quite strong, a discovery that raised our morale considerably. We needed to cling to some form of solidity to avoid recognition of the final tragedy which had engulfed us, and of our strictly limited choice between combat in the most desperate circumstances, captivity, or the end once and for all. Here, on the banks of the Vistula, which could be considered the cradle of hostilities, we found companies restocked with young boys to fill the gaping holes the war had made in our elite division. We also found some familiar faces, including Wiener, the veteran, who seemed quite astonished that we were all still alive. "We must really be indestructible," he exclaimed. "When I left you on the 2nd Dnieper front, everything looked so black I really thought I'd never see any of you again." "Quite a few missing," Wollers said. "And quite a few still here. Mein Gott, Leutnant. We told Wiener that Wesredau was dead, and Frosch, he too had a list of names we could forget. No matter how intense the grief aroused by any particular name, the expressions on our worn faces never changed. We pressed Wiener for news of Germany, of civilian life there, and the situation of ordinary citizens. We all had reasons for concern, and followed the movements of his lips, trying to grasp the implications of his inadequate words. "I was in the Kanzia military hospital in Poland," he told us. "I had lost so much blood, and seemed so weak that for 2 horrible days they did almost nothing about me. I would never have guessed that life had so strong a grip on me. It would have been so easy, one last sigh and then into the hole. But it didn't happen that way. I groaned and howled for 10 days or so, especially the first 2, and went through infection, transfusion, disinfection, reinfection, and here I am, back with you again, for another autumn of crap. Now I find the damp hard to take too. I've got rheumatism, and that's fatal." As before, the veteran relieved his desperation by cracking jokes. "But you must have had convalescent leave, didn't you?" "Yes, Hals. I was in Germany. I went to Frankfurt, not am Main, but am Oder. I could have gone further if I'd wanted to, but there wasn't any particular reason. They put us up in a girls' high school, sad to say, without the girls. There wasn't enough to eat, but at least they let us alone. Have you noticed, by the way, that I'm missing an ear?" The veteran grinned sardonically. When we looked, we saw that his right ear was gone, and that his skin, where the ear should have been, was a pale, shiny pink, which looked as though it might break at any minute. We had all noticed, without attaching any particular significance to it. So many men were missing one piece or another that we scarcely registered such things any more. "Yes," Prince said. "On that side you look dead." The veteran grinned again. "That's because you're so used to stiffs you're beginning to see them even where there aren't any." "Drop all the crap," Solmer shouted, "and tell us about Germany." "Well, yes." There was a moment of silence, which seemed to last forever. "What's it like in Frankfurt?" asked Feldwebel Spalowski, elbowing the rest of us aside. He came from Frankfurt, and his family was probably still there. The veteran was no longer looking at us. He seemed to be staring into his own interior. The high school was on the east banks of the Oder, up on a hill. You could see a big piece of the town from there. It was all grey, the colour of dead trees, with walls sticking up here and there, all black from the smoke of fires. People were living down there like Lanza in the trenches. As Spalowski listened, his face began to twitch, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "But our fighters, and flak, wasn't there any defence?" "Of course, but so out of proportion." "Don't worry too much, Spalowski," Wollers said. "Your family was certainly evacuated to the country." "No!" Spolowski shouted in a voice of despair. "My wife wrote me that she had been conscripted and had to stay in town. No one has the right to leave his job." Wiener knew very well what effect his words must have on an audience starved for good news, but nothing seemed to distress him any more. "It's total war," he said, like an automaton. "Nothing and no one will be spared, and German soldiers must be able to endure everything." Spolowski walked away. He looked stunned. His eyes were glazed, and his steps faltered, as if he were drunk. German soldiers would have to endure everything in the world we had created. We were fitted only for that world and were otherwise inadaptable. Lenson was as still as stone and listened, stony-faced. "Is it the same for all our towns?" Lindbergh asked. He must have been thinking of his town by Lake Constance. "I don't know," the veteran said. "It's possible." "You certainly know how to raise morale," said Hulls in irritation. "Do you want the truth or a fairy story?" I felt as though I were wandering through a landscape shrouded with fog and strewn with rubble. I knew that I could never manage to be disappointed again. Before mourning with the suffering world, I would somehow have to regain my balance. Of course I thought of Paula, but it was so long since I had heard anything from her that I wondered if I would even be capable of reading a letter if we should suddenly get mail. I was filling up with bad news like a barrel filling with water from a rainpipe. When the barrel is full to overflowing, all the torrents in the world are incapable of adding to its capacity. We found ourselves in one of the rare trains still moving through that region, rolling toward East Prussia through the first frosts of our third winter of war, the 5th or 6th for some of the older men. We moved at night, with all our lights out, as Russian planes, which occupied our bases in Poland, were particularly active by day. We were moving toward Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, and the Courland front, to which the remnants of several German divisions were clinging. Through the darkness and the thick fog, we could see large masses of people moving on foot across the northern Polish landscape. At first we thought we were watching infantry units on the march, but after several good looks, we realized we were watching civilians, thousands of them, fleeing through the night and fog to escape the red hordes who they sensed were very close behind them. We couldn't linger to watch those people, but could easily imagine their situation. Then we crossed the Prussian frontier into the home territory of Lenson and Smelens, two purebred Prussians suddenly back on their native soil. Lenson stood up and leaned over the carriage door to get a closer look at his country. The rest of us didn't care so much. The landscape was scarcely distinguishable from that of Poland. Perhaps there were a few more lakes. Otherwise, as in Poland, there was forest. "You really ought to see it when there's snow on the ground," Lenson said. He was suddenly smiling again. "This way you can't really tell what it's like." As we remained silent and uninterested, he spoke up again. "You're in Germany, for the love of God. Wake up. Think how long you've been dreaming of this." "East Germany," Wiener said. "Practically the front. And then, I don't know if you realize it, but I have a compass, and I can tell you we're moving to the northeast, which is no good at all." Once again, Lenson turned purple with anger. "You're nothing but a bunch of milksops," he said. "It's your kind of defeatism that's brought us to this. The war is already lost inside your goddamned heads, but you've got to fight anyway, whether you want to or not." "Shut up!" shouted 5 or 6 voices. "If they want us to win the war, let them treat us like normal soldiers. You're just a bunch of whining puppies. The whole time I've known you, you've done nothing but whine. For you, the war has been lost since Voronezh." "For good reason," Hulls said. "You'll fight, whatever the cost, and I'm the one who's telling you because you have no choice. There's no other way out." The veteran stood up. "Yes, Lenson, we'll fight, because we can't stand the idea of defeat any better than you can, and we have no choice. I don't, anyway. I'm part of a machine which operates a certain way, and only that way, and I've been part of it for too long." We stared at Wiener, somewhat taken aback. We had thought he would be able to adapt himself to any kind of life, and now here he was saying that he could live only for the cause which had already cost him so much. Lenson went on grumbling, and we went on thinking confusedly about the glimpse of the future the veteran had given us. For me, from the vantage point of Prussia, France seemed remote and unimportant. The cause which Wiener spoke of was also my cause, and despite all the difficulties and disappointments I had endured, I still felt closely linked to it. I knew that the struggle was becoming more and more serious, and that we would soon be obliged to face appalling possibilities. I felt a strong sense of solidarity with my comrades, and I could think of my own death without too much flinching, as a soothing veil that would fall slowly over me and all my terrors of the past, present, and future. My head seemed to be filled with a milky fog, which was without joy, but which suddenly made everything easy. Did my comrades feel the same way? I couldn't be sure, but my resignation seemed general. We rolled on for several hours at a reduced speed. Finally, we stopped and walked through the grey, foggy morning to a camp of wooden huts, whose appearance recalled the robust military organisation only recently lost. We were given an hour to rest, and the chance of a cup of hot water with a few grains of soya in it. "And to think that some fellows volunteered for the food," somebody muttered. "There couldn't be too many volunteering these days," another voice said. "Very few are around for long enough even to dream of becoming an officer. There's hardly the time to make Obergefreiter before they're getting a posthumous stripe." A few were still around for a little longer than that. Then a major, who was probably the camp commander, spoke to us. "Proud soldiers of the Gross Deutschland," he said, "your arrival in this sector fills us with joy. We know your reputation for courage in combat, which gives us a strong sense of support. Your comrades in arms in the infantry regiments fighting in the Polish forests near our frontiers feel as we do. Your arrival here reassures and comforts us, and also helps us in the extremely difficult task which has fallen on us, the defence of German and European liberty against the Bolsheviks, who would take it from us, employing the most extreme and bestial means. Today, more than ever before, our unity in combat must be total and deliberate. With the addition of your strength, we shall build a definitive rampart against the Soviet horde. Think of yourselves as the trailblazers of the European Revolution, and feel proud that you have been chosen for this undertaking, however heavy it may be. I wish the greatest possible glory for you, and convey to you the congratulations of the Führer and of the High Command. Transportation and food have been specially placed at your disposal to help you in achieving your aims. Bravo, soldiers, and courage! I know that so long as a single German soldier remains alive, no Bolshevik will ever tread on German soil. Heil Hitler! We gaped at the elegant officer in stunned silence, trying to penetrate the veil of ignorance which hid our valour from us. "Heil Hitler!" shouted a Feld, who realised that the prescribed response to the Major's remarks had not occurred. "Heil Hitler!" we shouted heroically. "Either I'm crazy," Kellerman muttered, "or he was expecting us to raise his morale." "Shh," said Prinz. "We're getting another speech." This time it was a Hauptmann. "It will be my privilege," he said, "to take 2/3 of the men in your regiment under my command and lead them into battle." We all had known what was waiting for us, but that phrase made us swallow hard. The entire division will be operating in a sector to the north of us. It will be broken up into several fragments so that a series of widely scattered attacks can be made against the Russian thrust, which is extremely strong in this sector. I am expecting from you the utmost in courage and actions of distinction and glory. These are essential because we must stop the Russians here. No negligence or hesitation will be allowed. 3 officers can constitute a court-martial at any time and sanction any penalty. Poor Frosch, how many officers decided to hang you? We shall be victorious here, or be covered with shame. No Bolshevik must ever, I repeat, ever set foot on German soil. And now, my friends, I have some good news for you. There is mail for some of you, and citations and promotions. But before giving free rein to your joy, you must present yourselves at the store for fresh rations and ammunition. Dismiss, Heil Hitler. We broke ranks without any clear idea of our situation. "Things are looking up," I said. "A bastard who'd be glad to see us all killed," muttered Hulls. We were standing in a long line in front of a large wooden building. So that's what we get instead of Wes Redau. Something tells me we'll be having a few eye-openers, Prince. Impossible. We've already seen everything there is to see. He's another one of these madmen, said Hulls. He's not. He's perfectly right, said another voice behind us. He's right. It has to be here, or not at all. I can't explain why without taking too long, but he's right. More and more disconcerted, we stared at Weena without saying a word, unable to grasp his attitude, which suddenly seemed so changed. I'll tell you why some other time, Weena said. For now, you're too thick to get it. As I write, I'm looking at the letter I've longed for so much, and as I read your lines, I forget the icy ground and the east, which is still so filled with menace. Your letter, which is in my hand, seems like a miracle from heaven. I don't expect anything more from the ordinary world, from which we seem entirely cut off. I read your lines as our comrade Smellens, who is lucky enough to believe in God, recites his prayers. Nothing can help us any more, Paula. Prayers seem like vodka. They blunt the cold for a moment. Happiness has become entirely relative and can mean simply daybreak, because darkness makes us think of death. I have been promoted to Obergefreiter, and although the stripes are still in my left pocket, I already feel that much more important. I think these extraordinary and difficult moments have made us into men. I can hear a roar in the east, Paula, but maybe it's only the wind. I look forward so much to reading another letter. For several days now, we had been fighting again as we retreated. The Bolsheviks must never set foot on German soil. However, 3 powerful Soviet armies had already crossed the German frontier at 5 or 6 points, penetrating to a depth of some 30 miles. These 3 armies had rolled over our defending troops, whose survivors were dragging with them through the autumn countryside the last weapons which supported their claim to be part of an army. To my regret, I am unable to retrace in detail the chaos of those bitter moments, but I can outline the ends of my friends, like Prince, Spalovsky, and Solma, and of Lenson, who, in spite of everything, was really a friend. And it is Lenson I wish to salute now, by describing the tragedy of his death, which I can still see clearly, through the memories of so many other deaths. Whatever Lenson may have thought of me at times, I am certain that for all of us, and for his country, he was a brave man, who would have sacrificed his life without hesitation to help the most insignificant fellow soldier. The manner of his death fully supports this view of him, and it is perhaps because of him that I am sitting here now, writing these lines. Lenson could never have accepted life as it is lived today, with all the concessions the former troops of the Eastern Front are obliged to make. Like the order for which he died, he was irreversible. Men who have embraced one idea can live only by and for that idea. Beyond it, they have nothing but their memories. Our attempt to save the Courland front failed, and the overpowering Russian thrust reached the Baltic at several points, which I can no longer locate with any precision. The northern front was cut in two, the far north around the Bay of Riga as far as Libau, and the sector to which we were sent, a continuously shrinking front to the west of Libau, in Prussia and Lithuania, clinging farther south to the Vistula, which was the scene of hideous carnage. The division was split into several small groups which attempted to throw the enemy off balance by attacking simultaneously at many points. For the most part, these attacks were unsuccessful and were hastily transformed into defensive actions. At that time, the division was precipitately attempting to regroup in order to establish a defensive front some 40 miles to the northwest. The bad roads, lack of fuel, mud, and faltering communications combined to slow down an operation that, under good conditions, wouldn't have lost us any time. In addition to these difficulties, we had to contend with increasingly active enemy aircraft. Each overflight spread fresh disorder through our already weakened columns. When the order to regroup came through, our officers decided that the retreat should be spread out and divided into small groups. This idea made sense as it offered less of a target to planes. However, when an enemy armoured unit encountered 2 or 3 widely dispersed companies, our chances of survival were at best problematical. Under these conditions, in a village of scattered houses, an encounter occurred that almost erased our group from the divisional list. "I'm sure I've been here before," said Lenson, shocked by the misery of the country. "Everything looks so different now that I don't recognize any details, but I'm sure that over that way there are some villages I know. My own village is about 60 miles from here." He gestured toward the southwest. "Königsberg is over that way. I've been there several times, and once I went to Kranz too. It was raining cats and dogs, but we went swimming anyway." He laughed, and we listened. Despite the crushing retreat and numbing cold, Lenson seemed to have revived on his native soil. However, he felt the anguished silence of this village, whose inhabitants had fled the day before, more intensely than the rest of us. 300 of us, exhausted by a 12-mile march over waterlogged ground that had begun at dawn, were sitting doubled up for warmth, waiting for an uncertain 11 o'clock distribution of food. Only Lenson was on his feet, pacing up and down the length of the stable wall, which the rest of us were leaning against, sheltering from the incessant rain. We heard his voice against a background of explosions, which were more or less loud, more or less distant, coming from the southeast. We scarcely noticed the sounds of war anymore. They had become so much the ordinary background of our lives that we no longer paid attention to them unless they were inside a perimeter small enough to threaten immediate danger. Except for the noise to the east, everything was quiet. We were somewhat like people who cannot enjoy peace and quiet without a phonograph, who need noise before they can relax. Perhaps they are simply afraid of true silence. Unfortunately for us, we had no control over the volume of noise, and in fact would have been much happier without it. Except for Lenson's harangue, nothing was happening. Some 25 yards from us, 6 men were preparing lunch. Somewhat further off, another group was seriously engaged in attending to personal needs. Others were resting, with their eyes half closed or staring into space, dizzy with exhaustion. The melancholy autumn weather brushed our faces with its damp freshness. We had been through so much misery that we were unable to appreciate conditions that ordinarily would have moved us to pity. Through our condition of near torpor, we were dimly aware of suffering and weeping. The wounded were groaning and dying, but none of that stopped anyone from sleeping whenever there was a chance. The first part of our meal had been passed out: cellophane sausages stuffed with soybean puree, 1 for every 2 men. It goes without saying that these were cold. During the retreat, the men in charge of supply, with a stirring display of professional conscience, had collected enough old and wrinkled potatoes to fill a sidecar. They were just handing them around to the men when 4 soldiers jumped over a wall. They were gasping for breath, and as they ran toward us, they made large, sweeping gestures with their arms. One of them called to us without shouting too loud, "Ivan!" The sluggish mass of men stood up with a single movement. We knew that the next few minutes could face us with the most appalling danger. With the instinct of hunted beasts, we had already scattered, each man running to wherever he saw a possibility of the slightest protection. Those who were lucky enough to have already received their food wolfed it down hastily. Lieutenant Vollers had just joined us in a recess sheltered by a roof. His field radio, which he always kept near him, was already crackling out an alert. We waited in silence for about 10 minutes, but nothing happened. The Russians could not have been very far off, as our sentries had announced them. But none of us knew whether we would be dealing with a section or a squad, a regiment or 10 men. We hastily organized patrols. We had to find out whether we were going to fight or run as fast as we could. The 6 fellows nearest Vollers were sent toward the wall our 2 sentries had jumped. I was among them. 2 other groups of about the same size were sent in other directions. To describe my desperation and terror would be repetitive. It was the same as at Ucheni, Belgorod, the sheds where the partisans had hidden, and so on. Like everyone else, I was resigned to the bad moments of our existence, to the sinking feeling which comes with being ripped from sleep to meet some disagreeable obligation. This was like that, only more so. We moved along the other side of the stable against which we had been dozing a few moments before, and came out onto a rough piece of ground stacked with old timbers. We were fully aware of our danger, and a heavy sense of desperation, which no longer accelerated the beating of our hearts, made us alternately hate death and long for it. My Mauser weighed down my hands like an object of no value, on which I could no longer count for anything. Formerly, as we marched through Polish and Russian villages, its weight of wood and metal had given me such a sense of confidence that I had felt almost invulnerable. Today, the possibility of organizing any kind of effective defense with these weapons seemed entirely unlikely. We crossed the waste ground and arrived at a cluster of buildings, where we separated into 2 groups of 3 men each and continued to advance as carefully as if we were carrying explosives. We turned the corner of the building and were able to see a much larger piece of the horizon, marked by a line of trees that had been almost entirely stripped of branches. Beyond the trees was a road swarming with men. In the distance we could see still more approaching. "There must be at least 300 or 400 of them," whispered the man next to me. "Look over there." We walked back past the building where we had been resting earlier. At its far end, a row of tar barrels stood out very black against the chalky soil. Beyond them was a small house. Our steps made a light crunching noise against the fine gravel. Still silent, we stepped into the space beyond the barrels. We took 4 steps and found ourselves face to face with 4 Russian soldiers on patrol, who were taking the same precautions and observing the same silence we were. For us, all process of thought froze. Our gestures were without haste. The Russians opposite us were also moving very slowly and watching us. It seemed as if, by some miracle, the same calm had been imposed on both sides. No one fired. With deliberate, calculated movements, both Russians and Germans withdrew to the shelter of the building. We stared at each other with enormous eyes. "We've seen enough of them," muttered Wiener. "Half turn." We went back to our starting point, and Wiener made his report. We felt as if we'd been dreaming. A quarter of an hour later, we had set up our defences in the northern part of the village and its approaches. According to our intelligence, we were involved with an infantry regiment of some 2,000 or 3,000 men. There were 300 of us, but we were not ordered to retreat. Hours of agonized waiting went by. We were used to lengthy Russian preparations, but we also knew how steady their thrust would be. By the time the first contacts occurred, it was already growing dark. The first Russian assault units moved carefully up to the buildings under cover of dusk. The waves of Russian infantry no longer had the same dash as at Belgorod or on the Dnieper. Such astounding losses had been inflicted on those howling mobs throughout the reconquest of their territory that the Russian High Command had been obliged to conceive a somewhat less heroic tactic. Also, although they were fiercely determined to revenge themselves on us by trampling on German soil, they were fully expecting us to mount a desperate resistance. And they had come to count more heavily on the effectiveness of their tanks and aviation to reduce our smaller, under-equipped units. On our side, the magnificent lines of shouting soldiers were becoming increasingly rare, while the Bolsheviks were increasingly fighting in a European style, using techniques more or less learned from us. This shift did not make our position any easier. Our group fired at a Russian patrol leaping toward us, but we saved our mortar for later. We were beginning to run out of shells. This was only a small encounter, which seemed without importance to men accustomed to tornadoes of fire. A few fragments of brass hurtling through the dusk, breaking a shoulder, crushing a breastbone, or carrying off a life. Nothing, in short, which even approximated the pitch of a real battle. Of course, if the same exchange should take place in Paris today, it would be considered sufficiently serious to empty a whole section of the city and make all the headlines. Each time has its own habits and style. Throughout that black and foggy night, the Russians continued to dig in beside our precarious positions. The thought that they might burst out at any minute was terrifying enough to make us sick. Perhaps this evening would be our last. Ivan would overrun us and put an end to this desperate chase which had lasted for nearly 2 years and covered thousands of miles marked with fear and blood. Probably tonight would be the night. We no longer knew what to hope for. But the night went by, a night of cold watchfulness broken by flares and distinguished by nothing in particular. The Russians, who seemed to be in no hurry, watched us as we watched them. I even managed to sleep despite the watch we were supposed to keep unbroken. Several others did the same, and it was only the cold that kept us from having a real rest. Finally, dawn broke, and with it our tension increased. The air and ground shook. The rain, which usually muffles noise, seemed to have no effect on the heavy grinding of chains and the percussive exhaust of a large number of armoured vehicles. A column of tanks was driving toward the motionless village, where Russian infantry was already waiting, calm and resolute, for our deaths. We knew that there were not enough of us for any kind of defence against tanks. We had no anti-tank guns, and the few Panzerfausts we had left would never be able to stop that mass of tanks, which we judged from the noise to be quite large. Our hair bristled with cold and fear as we organised our disengagement with the speed that had become familiar. Everyone was on foot except for the drivers of our 2 sidecars, which were used for liaison between the command group and ourselves. 10 soldiers were harnessed to each gun, as we couldn't let the Russians hear the sound of engines. The company withdrew in a silence worthy of Hollywood Indians, leaving just enough men to form 3 interception groups. Each of these was made up of 10 men, with 2 Jägerpanzerfausts and 4 covering riflemen. My group included Smellens and a young boy who had been specially trained in handling a Panzerfaust. Lindbergh, 2 other fellows, and I covered them. This proved to be the only time I was ever in command, a unique and tragic time during which I was responsible for 5 other men. In the second group, I knew Lenson at the Panzerfaust. In the third group, no one. Each anti-tank group had 3 Panzerfausts, heavy, cumbersome weapons that allowed us a total of 18 chances. With maximum luck, if we hit home every time, we could hope to stop 18 of the 60 to 80 tanks we knew were coming toward us. We stiffened with terror as we grasped the desperate reality of our situation. Lieutenant Vollers told us that the enemy was slowing down and that when 5 or 6 of their tanks were in flames, their demoralization would increase. He said that we would rejoin the company within 24 hours. But nothing could distract us from the horrible mathematics of the situation. We knew too well that the implacable thrust of the war could not be stopped. Today, on this day accursed of all others, our turn would probably come. The rest of the company moved silently past us as we listened to the final recommendations of our superior. The rumble of tanks continued unbroken. I saw Hals going by beside the veteran and ran out to grasp his hand. Lieutenant Vollers stopped talking when he noticed me. I produced a few obscenities for Hals and Wiener, inappropriate to the gravity of the moment, and briefly considered giving Hals something to send to my family later, but I couldn't find anything and limited myself to a hoarse laugh. Hals couldn't think of anything to say to me, and Wiener dragged him off. Vollers left us next, and our groups separated. I remained alone with my command, and with my doubtful friend Lindbergh, who had turned white and numb with fear. I, much too young for the job myself, had become a group leader, charged with dragging 5 other boys who had not yet attained their majorities into a horrible game of cops and robbers. I threw a quick glance at my subordinates. They were staring toward the south, where the noise was coming from. Lenson shouted and waved toward a dip in the ground, where there were 4 or 5 buildings, probably a farm. I and my group ran after Lenson. The third group looked for somewhere to hide along the road. The wind was blowing in gusts, carrying the first half-formed flakes of the season. At that moment, the Russians began to pound the positions we had just left. The houses in the village about half a mile away were surrounded by geysers of black earth. Hastily, I sent my 2 Jaegers to a position among the large roots of some overturned trees. They began to dig frantically, trying to lower themselves a little deeper into the ground. The rest of us looked for shelter nearby. I was with a young fellow whose name I forget, but whose expression of determined tenacity remains ineffaceable. Lindbergh and our 6th man ran into the house behind us. 100 yards to our left, I could see Lenson and his assistant. The Russians were pounding the village into the ground. It was lucky we had left it when we did. As we listened once again to the noise of tanks rolling through smoking ruins, we relived the sensation of waiting through the unbearably long minutes just before action begins. We tried hard to think, but the diabolic round of our past unwound through our memories, good and bad moments in a rush too fast for any of the relief tenderness can bring. For me, there was a mixture of childhood, the war, Paula, and all the things I still had to do and should have done, the kind of debt which weighs on the heart when time for settling has run out. We were all torn between wanting to weep and run away, and to scream and run out to meet the danger. No Bolshevik will ever tread on German soil. But they were there by thousands, crushing it with frenzy and jubilation, and there were 18 of us to stop them. 18 young men ready to cling to any miraculous superstition to go on hoping for a future as tormented as the present. Then they appeared, 10 of them at first, following the road guarded by our third group. The third group watched them coming and did their duty. We helped them, inspired by almost unbearable emotion, played out by thousandths of a second. The first tank was stopped some 20 yards from the 2 Panzerfausts in the third group. One of their projectiles burst on the tank's front apron, scattering a shower of rivets and killing the monster and its occupants. Others were slowly manoeuvring, heavily attacking the incline of the bank to make their way around the burning tank. I couldn't stop myself from whispering, "They're coming for us." But the tanks, 3 to be exact, climbed back to face up to the threat. They hoped to frighten the anti-tank crew, counting heavily on their terrifying appearance, a calculation which almost always worked. However, a second monster burst into flame. The tank behind it brushed past, opening up a passage. It reached the German position and broke its occupant's nerve. We saw our comrades jump from their hole and run like madmen. They were trying to reach the woods and began to climb the hill. The tank, which was following right behind them, drew so close it almost touched them before knocking them to pieces with the machine guns on board. The rest of the defence suffered the same fate. In 3 or 4 minutes the third group was knocked out. 10 or 12 tanks were roaring down the road the company had taken, on foot, an hour earlier. They were certainly too far for us to try to reach them with any prospect of success. 5 more tanks appeared, following the dip of the valley, driving straight at the farm and at Lenson, who was just in front of it. Lenson and his number 2 man fired at the tanks, which were about 20 yards from them. They hit 2, and the noise of the explosions flooded the valley with a wave of sound. A third tank passed the 2 wrecks and seemed to be heading directly for my group. Lenson's group fired a third time, missing the tank and nearly killing us. A building some 5 yards from our hole burst into flame. The explosion half buried us and made us totally deaf for nearly a minute. The 3 tanks continued, pouring fire into the farm buildings. They must have thought our defence was centred there. 2 more T-34S, which had just appeared on the road, left it, driving at Lenson's position. They were out of our range, but we fired at them anyway. Smellens fired at a tank about 150 yards away and just missed it. The shell touched the ground, bounced off it, and landed farther off without exploding. All we had done was to draw their attention to us. One of the tanks drove straight at us, using all its guns. I could hear the shouts of my men. They were unable to fix their sights on the huge machine, which drove at the ruins of the house and skidded over them, probably in the belief that they were crushing us beneath their tracks. I could hear the grinding from my hole, a sound I shall never forget. The monster stopped short and turned back toward its original route along the road. Lower down, the David and Goliath battle between Lenson's group and 4 more tanks, all firing with all their guns, continued. We heard the final crash of Lenson's Panzerfaust. The tank closest to them turned back on its tracks, bumping the tank behind it. We could hear horrible screams through the demented confusion of smoke and flame. A T-34 drove straight over the hole which sheltered Lenson and his companion. Then it reversed and levelled the place. So Lenson died on the soil of Prussia, where he had wished to die. For us, the nightmare went on. If the tanks left us to continue their advance, we would be in terror of the infantry, which must be right behind them. In a state of indescribable fear, we looked about us. By we, I mean myself and my companion in our hole, and the 2 others who remained as motionless as the roots that sheltered them. What had happened to Lindbergh and to the 6th man in my group? They had probably been crushed in the debris of the building knocked down by the tank. For the moment, that was the only possible conclusion. I also knew that the group on the road had been knocked out and that Lenson had died a horrible death. Where were the rest of his men? Perhaps they too were lying under the rubble of the farm. Probabilities and possibilities poured through my head. It was most unlikely that any of us could remain unseen against that pale grey soil, where every protuberance was marked by a dark shadow. I thought of making a break for it, but quickly realized that every way out was, in fact, impossible. I might head for the pine woods to the left, but that meant at least 300 yards entirely in the open. The Popovs would be sure to see me before I had gone even halfway. There was still a lot of smoke, but most of it was rising vertically and wouldn't hide anything. Suddenly, in a spasm of egotism, I felt myself caught in a trap from which there was no escape. I was so sure of this that I ordered my companion to shoot me. He was feeling much as I was, and stared at me with anguish. "No," he said, "I could never do that, but I wish you would kill me. Please, kill me." Caught in our grotesque dilemma, we stared at each other, full of mistrust and rancour, each trying to hand over sole responsibility to the other. "We're going to die here, you bastard," I snarled. "So shoot me. That's an order." "No, no, I can't," he sobbed. "You're afraid of being left alone, that's all." "Yes, and so are you." "But don't you see there's nothing else we can do?" We could hear the sound of fighting. It was coming from the north, from behind us. "Those bastards must have caught up with the company," I said. The noise continued. We stared at each other, motionless and silent. There was no more to say, because everything had already been said a long time ago. Then my two forward men appeared, and a few moments later Lindbergh, dragging along with him a fellow with a badly swollen face. We all squatted down, and then someone noticed some men whose moving figures blotted out the ruins of the farm. They were moving forward by cautious leaps, toward the woods, some 150 yards to the left. "We should get over there too," pleaded Lindbergh. "The Russians are nearly here." "That's easy enough to say," I answered. "But look at the open ground we'd have to cross. The Russians would see us right away." No one could argue with that. Everyone looked from the woods to the edge of the village to me. If only at that moment I had possessed the conviction and the decisiveness to impose on the others an idea of what to do, to take responsibility for the men entrusted to me. I remained as I was, incapable of dealing with either the circumstances or the men who were looking to me for some sort of initiative. The damning appraisal Lenson had once made of me seemed crushingly true. I was unworthy of command, incapable of leading, and it was here, 100 yards from the site of Lenson's heroic death, that my incapacity manifested itself. I remained where I was, overwhelmed by the 1,000 miseries of our situation, internally sobbing with despair. I felt that my companions would make for themselves the decision I was unable to impose on them with any authority. Was I a simple coward? Wasn't I really as bad as Lindbergh, whose all-too-obvious fear had so often disheartened us? I no longer wished for death, but simply cursed my existence, which had become a series of nightmares. On that day, at a critical moment, I failed. I failed in everything I had hoped for, from others and from myself. My head wobbled on my neck like the head of a drunk at the moment when his condition changes over from hilarity to despair. I was there, fully conscious, aware of everything but paralyzed by insurmountable panic. I shall never forgive myself for that instant when reality touched the deepest recesses of my being. Minutes went by, and my condition remained unchanged. Minutes I should have been putting to good use. Fear nailed me where I was, in the midst of 5 other human beings who were all on the brink of madness. I was no longer trying to see where our danger might be coming from, but was turned inward on myself. I found nothing but despair. We could hear more tanks, the grinding of tracks and the roar of engines. I began to tremble uncontrollably, unable to tear myself from my obsession. The others were clinging to each other, their faces distorted with fear, ready to scream. Lindbergh stood up in spite of himself. He wanted to see what was happening. He had lost his gun and was no longer thinking of defending himself. A wild thought had entered his stunned mind. He fell forward, across the edge of the hole, trembling convulsively like me. He had just clenched his fists around 2 stick grenades. Death was stalking us, approaching with giant steps. This time, with a horrible shudder, I could feel its presence. Once again, from all sides, we heard the firing of big guns. The explosions nearest us destroyed what was left of our lucidity. We were no longer in a state to understand anything, except that we could also hear the sound of a truck quite nearby. Then we heard the barking of light machine guns. We stared at each other without words. The sound of a voice speaking German fell on our incredulous ears. Behind the shattered building, beside a truck with a throbbing engine, some men were speaking German. We heard more tanks and automatic weapons and stayed where we were, stiff with fear. A man leaned over our hole, a German officer. We observed his presence without really seeing him. Perhaps he thought we were dead. He went away again. But a few minutes later, 2 Panzer Grenadiers led us from that hole, and we followed meekly. The anticipated German counterattack had taken place, led by 2 SS armoured regiments, and had caught the Russians on the flank, inflicting heavy losses. We even took back the village for a few days before continuing our retreat. We moved back to the north, as a junction with the Courland front was no longer possible. What was left of the division gradually regrouped. The attempt to reunite the front had inflicted terrible losses. During this time, in a desperate lunge further to the south, the Russians reached the Baltic. Fighting of unequalled ferocity had taken place at many points through and around the swarms of terrified refugees, who made it very difficult for our troops to defend themselves. The entire Prussian civilian population was fleeing toward the coast in a tragic tide. We ourselves had 2 choices. We could turn south, opening a route through several advanced Soviet positions, or move back to the north, toward the newly established front at Memel. However, the divisional command quickly realized that we no longer had the means to move south toward Königsberg or even Elbing. Both towns were equally threatened, and the closest was some 100 miles away. We would have to fight for every mile, with little chance of success and almost no possibility of picking up any food along this route of mass exodus. So Memel was chosen, a short front which had been practically surrounded since the autumn. We would have to fight our way through to make a passage for ourselves and for the flood of refugees moving with us, constantly slowing us down and often nearly paralyzing us, a pitiful, imploring procession, dragging on foot through the bitter cold and the slush of the first snows. In spite of orders, we had to help, reassure and support this chaotic wash of human beings. Everyone with an engine which would still run, even for an hour, carried a swarm of terrified children, trembling with cold and fear and God knows what else, while their families ran alongside, mixed in with the soldiers who were their last hope of protection. We passed through towns and villages where the inhabitants had still been living a more or less normal life until 4 or 5 days earlier, although they had realized that their danger might become imminent at any time. Now, for the last 2 days, old men, women and children had been desperately digging out the trenches, gun pits and anti-tank ditches which were to stop the waves of enemy tanks. This pathetic and heroic effort before the infernal debacle which would sweep them into the flux of terrorized civilians was a preliminary shock for these virtuous civilians, who saw the front coming toward them in the form of exhausted, half-starved troops, tired of fighting and of living, who brushed aside human pawns without a qualm, as if they were pieces in a losing game of chess. Every time a defence seemed possible, it was undertaken. The enemy at our heels was slaughtering the civilian population, who watched their approaching end in mute horror. The enemy had to be slowed down. The groups impressed into this effort accepted their fate in the ludicrous hope of putting out fires which were already raging. Their situation and sentiments were understood, and their misery measured and valued by those who came to bid them farewell. These men had reached the point beyond which death seemed desirable, and still the war went on, like a blazing fire which no sentiment, however realized, could stop. Those who broke through and reached Memel would probably die at Memel. Death at Memel would seem a relief and release, and a more orderly end than death in a place which would never be distinguished by any military operation. At this time and place, the absolute would be resolved by the absurd, unless perhaps they were already the same thing. Finally, our division, which is to say a third of it, broke through, and the command at Memel was able to include it in their strength. The division had broken through, and the 1,500 men it cost us simply represented another figure to swell the note of heroism. For those who had been in the fighting, besides the men who were killed, the losses included some 20 names which had to be scrubbed from the company lists, including Seamanlace and Vienke. We might perhaps have fought our way into a trap. We even thought that perhaps the Russians had deliberately loosened their grip to let us through. We had brought along with us as many civilians as we could, but many others had stayed behind, and for them the game was nearly over. They had to dodge the tanks pursuing them, and multiple barrages of howitzers and quadruple machine guns and Ivan's bayonets, all of which is very difficult for a mother with an infant at her breast and a small child hanging onto her skirts. But after all, everyone is born to die. We arrived in Memel with trucks pulled by men and tanks serving as locomotives to trains of incredible length. We had reached the absolute limit of our capacities. Everything which still possessed a shred of human or mechanical life was moving, suppressing misery to a sense of gratitude that so much, at least, was still allowed them. Bombings stopped only those who were definitively dead. The rest, the merely wounded or dying, kept on, with burning eyes, pushing past the collapsing and the collapsed, whose bodies lay strewn along the road. The town of Memel was still alive, in ruins beneath the flames, the smoke-darkened sky, the throb of Russian fighter-bombers, the heavy artillery, the terror, and the whirling snow. Once again, I cannot find the words to describe what I saw. My impression is that all words and syllables were perfected to describe unimportant things. Words cannot describe the end of the war in Prussia. I was part of the exodus in France, fleeing the German troops which I later joined, and I saw mothers asking for milk at quiet farms. I also saw overturned cars, and was once even machine-gunned near Montargis. But my memories of all that are touched with only a small degree of anxiety, which is even somewhat intoxicating, like the memory of a trip on which one was not alone. Also, in France, the weather was beautiful. In Prussia, it was snowing, and everything had been destroyed all around us. Refugees were dying by the thousands, and no one was able to help them. The Russians, when they were not fighting our troops, pushed the tide of civilians along in front of them, firing at them and driving tanks through the terrified mob. Anyone with a little imagination can try to conceive what I am talking about. Cruelty has never been more fully realized, nor can the word horror ever adequately express what happened. We had reached the Memel cul-de-sac, a half-circle about 15 miles across, backing onto the Baltic, whose cold grey swells rolled in under a thick blanket of fog. We held this constantly shrinking space by some inexplicable miracle for most of the winter, harassed by continuous bombardment and permanent attack from the Russians, whose strength grew steadily as hours dwindled, overrun by thousands upon thousands of refugees. The extreme misery to which these people were reduced can never be adequately described. They waited at Memel to be evacuated by sea before the troops were taken off in mid-December. The ruins of Memel could neither hold nor shelter the large segment of the Prussian population which had sought refuge there. This population, to which we could give only the most rudimentary help, paralysed our movements and our already precarious system of defence. Within the half-circle we were defending, ringing with the thunder of explosions which covered every sort of shriek and scream, former elite troops, units of the Volkssturm, amputees re-engaged by the services organising the defence of the town, women, children, infants and invalids were crucified on the frozen earth beneath a ceiling of fog lit by the gleam of fires, or beneath the blizzards which emptied their snows over this semi-final act of the war. The food ration was so meagre that the occasional distributions which were supposed to feed 5 people for a day would not now be considered enough for a school-child's lunch. Appeals for order and observation of the restrictions rang incessantly through the fog, which in part veiled the scene. Ships of every kind were leaving by day and by night, loaded with as many people as they could carry. Long files of refugees, whom the authorities tried vainly to register, moved toward the piers, creating targets for Russian pilots that were impossible to miss. The bombs opened hideous gaps in the screaming crowd, which died in fragments beneath these blows, but remained in line in hopes of getting on the next ship. These people were exhorted to patience, reminded of the rationing, and told to fast while they waited for deliverance. Old people killed themselves, and mothers of families would hand their children over to another woman, begging her to feed them with the ration card she herself was giving up. A gun taken from a dead soldier would accomplish these jobs. Heroism and despair were closely intertwined. The authorities tried to keep up the spirits of the crowd by speaking of the future, but at that time and place, everything had lost its importance. These martyrs often watched suicides without really trying to stop them. Some, in a surge of madness, shot themselves on the pile of bodies which civilian aides collected in each district. Capitulation would at least have put an end to this hideous nightmare. But Russia inspired such terror and had demonstrated such cruelty that no one even considered the idea. We had to hold, no matter what it cost us, until we were eventually evacuated by sea. We had to hold or die. Or perhaps the High Command had another idea. Perhaps they were planning to transform the stronghold at Memel into a bridgehead from which they would launch a counterattack to split the Soviet thrust. This last speculation struck those of us holding the town as sheer fantasy. However, soldiers were still landing at Memel as the civilians left. We could only suppose they had come to strengthen our position. The idea of a counterattack seemed entirely unrealistic. Here we fought with the stubbornness so much admired by the High Command, solely because we still hoped there might be some sort of launch left at the end to take us out after the last civilian had been evacuated. We had to hold on, even if despair had separated us from all other human conditions. At Memel, no one could stay out of the fighting. Children and young girls dried their tears and helped the wounded, distributing food, resisting their desire to devour it, and suppressing horror and fear which were so fully justified. They performed tasks which their overburdened elders gave them, without argument or complaint. One either died or lived. No intermediate condition could be given any consideration. The children all felt this fact, without discussion or explanation. Those who survived this dramatic training would never be able to take the normal difficulties of normal life seriously. The German people really experienced the depth of things, and left me with an ineffable feeling of respect, which I can describe no further. In the disorder of our advanced positions, civilians sometimes became directly involved in the fighting beside the soldiers. These civilians were often women. At the price of heavy sacrifice, the front held. By held, I mean that it did not crumble altogether. In fact, it was constantly yielding in one or several places and constantly shrinking. The long anti-tank trenches we had dug beforehand played a large part in the consolidation of our defence. The Russians depended above all on their aviation and their heavy artillery, which they strengthened constantly to knock us out. Nonetheless, their attacks cost them heavily. The contraction of our front allowed us to concentrate our defence. Memel was ringed with innumerable carcasses of Russian tanks, and there were as many anti-tank gunners as there were ordinary soldiers. Carloads of mines were driven out by civilian volunteers and placed in front of our defences by the infantry in the course of small counterattacks organised solely for this manoeuvre. We were defenceless only against aviation. Russian fighter bombers flew over continually. To the northwest of our position, the remains of several dismantled railway carriages underwent 8 attacks in 2 days. What was left of our anti-aircraft defence was concentrated around the piers, where the peril was greatest. This target constituted a real danger to the Russian pilots, who preferred to attack the rest of the stronghold, where there was no serious resistance. Thus, despite the hell of cold and fire and shortage, despite the names scratched daily from our lists, Memel, almost incredibly, held. Then, one grey afternoon, some elements of our famous division were regrouped at a precise point. Ammunition for an offensive was handed out, and we were given 2 tins of food each, without regard to the contents. Some received a pound of applesauce, others a pound of margarine. However, these variations seemed insignificant compared to the fact that the ghost of German military organization was still functioning during those days of grace on the fringes of a disintegrated city, which would still be known as Memel for a short time. Supplies, although obviously rationed to the limit, were still distributed before an offensive. Incredible as it may now seem, the vestigial remnants of the German army in Memel were to attempt an offensive to the south, whose aim was to re-establish contact with the front at Krantz and Königsberg. The officers who prepared the manoeuvre issued their directives to the disillusioned ears of combat veterans. Hals and I were jolted from the void in which we had grown used to living. We were accustomed to the most astounding orders, but this time the fact that we were going to hurl ourselves into an assault with the incredibly slender means available to us made us tremble and reel with uncontrollable vertigo. A few tanks which were still intact would support our progress. Materiel which belonged to the Courland soldiers, and even some from Germany, had been delivered. We were to proceed to a village some 10 miles to the south, on the road which followed the coast, beside a large bay. The commanding officer of the operation chose a moment of appalling weather to launch his offensive. It was simultaneously snowing and raining. The atmospheric conditions were so disastrous that even the Russian artillery had practically stopped functioning. It was this circumstance which our leaders hoped to exploit on our last lunatic expedition. A dozen dirty grey tanks went out to meet an inexorable fate. The black crosses painted on their grey sides, the colour of our misery, were scarcely visible. Inside the turrets, the ride of the Valkyrie was coming over the shortwave radios, a fitting accompaniment to supreme sacrifice. Decrepit trucks carrying field pieces and heavy machine guns followed close behind, replacing the full-track caissons of panzer grenadiers of our prosperous days. A mass of infantry, mixed with the remnants of naval and aerial groups, ran along beside the motorized Materiel. My group, in which, to my joy, I recognized the faces of Hals and Wiener, were clinging to the exposed chassis of an automobile which had been stripped of its skin. With ludicrous ease, our point units surprised a camp of Russian armour lined up under the snow as if on parade. The Russians, staggered by this absolutely unforeseen blow, abandoned the camp, which we burned, using one of our special incendiary techniques. A supply of Soviet fuel allowed us to think of pushing our offensive even farther, and we went on, despite the gusts of wind which lashed our hands and cheeks. Several concentrations of Russian troops gave way before our surprise thrust. However, the enemy was massed around Memel in depth, and as soon as they struck back, our thrust came to an end. We could hear the first Russian reaction and knew that we would soon be inundated by a merciless rain of fire, and that the first Russian tanks were already rolling toward us. As things were reaching a critical point for us, we heard artillery fire from the sea. The bad weather prevented us from seeing the ships just offshore, but their providential fire fell on the red tide as it moved toward us. 2 or 3 destroyers or torpedo boats had come especially to support us. Despite zero visibility, the coordinates supplied by our tanks in forward positions enabled the ships to fire with considerable precision, and the Russian thrust was more or less stopped. It was also possible that the Russians, who were further inland, misjudged the source of our fire and supposed that we possessed more ground artillery than we actually did. However, none of this made any real difference. The Russians possessed infinitely greater means than we did. Toward the end of the day, our meagre operation was attacked along a flank of some 6 miles. This was much more than we could take. Soon half our tanks were on fire. As foreseen, we had failed and were ordered to return to Memel, 6 miles back the way we'd come, which was far more difficult than the way out. We abandoned the road we had followed for our last epic attack, except for our motorized Materiel, which separated as widely as possible when the Russians fired. In the darkness, striped with thousands of lights, breathless troops were running across the dunes from one hole to the next, valuing each step which brought them closer to Memel. As a crowning blow, the column had to cross a stretch of road we ourselves had mined that morning. We tramped a mile lit by flares and streaked with white flashes. The road was narrow, but still more or less intact, except for a few shell holes. The first vehicles drove full speed down that infernal space. The Russians had not yet had the time to adjust their aim, and their shells fell beyond us. However, their second round was more successful. 2 trucks were hit dead on and disintegrated. 2 more, although they were mangled and torn, got through to less dangerous ground. The wreckage of the first 2 obstructed the road, and we were sent to clear it away. Ivan was now quite close, letting us have it with grenade launchers and peppering us with machine gun fire. Despite our intense terror, we tried to keep on firing back as we climbed the slippery banks of flying gravel. The ditches where we might have found shelter had been mined. We were caught in a trap we had prepared ourselves. Several of our men fell, their arms flung outward and their eyes fixed for the last time on the dark, tormented sky. While we waited, our small band clung to the possibilities of survival. We waited beside the first 2 vehicles, which had been wrecked and were obstructing the passage. All around us, Russian grenades were exploding, illuminating the darkness. A Russian quadruple machine gun was spraying the edge of the ditch, which was luckily somewhat higher than the road. The Russian guns swept much of the wreckage from the road, jarring the shattered heaps further into disintegration with each salvo. Beside these fragments of metal, which had lost almost all their shape, lay 2 men in their ragged uniforms, men who, like us, had believed in a way out and were now eternally at rest. We would have to clear the road of the wreckage which still obstructed it, but anyone who stood up would probably be hit. Once again, Wiener, the veteran, emerged from our petrified group. On his knees under the flying bullets, he hurled a grenade at the first heap of metal and blew it from the road. The second wreck went up the same way. The third, a 3.5-ton truck, required 4 grenades. Unfortunately, the wounded men inside the truck were blown up too, but that's war. Toward midnight, at the height of the storm, 2/3 of our men were back in Memel. The command had become aware of our enterprise and had provided covering fire. In a state of exhaustion, we arrived at the rear of our entrenched camp. Inventory of the missing was taken outside, among the ruins of a bathing establishment. Then, in the perpetual roar of noise from the front, we settled down and tried to sleep, even though the circumstances were so heavily against it that the attempt itself was an act of heroism. The next day, toward 11 in the morning, when we had finished eating the rations distributed before the offensive, we were sent back to posts which had to be defended. In our dramatic situation, our rest periods could not be of any greater duration. Civilians continued to embark, despite all the risks this entailed. Seas were running high, and all the buildings were covered with frost. Their human complement was waiting to leave from the jetty. Although the waves sprayed their bluish faces, there wasn't the slightest murmur of complaint. Our troops continued to deny the Russians access to the town and its immediate surroundings. The possibility of evacuation by sea represented such a lifeline that a maximum effort was mounted to make it possible for us to hold on. Food, munitions, and medicines were sent in. On certain days, our hammering from the Russians seemed to be diminishing, and despite the cold, which grew daily more intense, life seemed easier. We didn't realize that the Soviet armies were concentrating their efforts farther south. Königsberg, Heiligenbeil, Elbing, and then Gotenhafen were increasingly threatened. The problem of refugees, as I learned later, was 10 times greater in those places. The Russians abandoned Memel for the moment to cut further into Prussia, where they were met with desperate resistance. However, they swept it all aside. The 3 powerful Soviet armies which had entered German territory possessed means infinitely greater than those remaining to us. In addition to this, they were inspired by savage feelings of vengeance. The tortured population of Prussia was indelibly instructed in what this meant. Elsewhere, scattered through the population, were Lithuanians, anti-communist Russians, Poles, and even English and Canadian prisoners who shared our fate, even at Memel. The general terror of Russia superseded all national divisions and differences of opinion. It was a brute fact, simple and unassimilable. When no other course was possible, everyone fled, even the English and Canadian prisoners. The likelihood of being distinguished by the Russian assault units was too doubtful. Women of all ages were exposed to another form of outrage. The number of people evacuated by sea must have risen into the millions. The veteran had carefully set up his FM in the ruins of a house whose walls rose no higher than 3 feet from the ground. From time to time he brushed the snow from the breach with the back of his hand, which had turned grey from repeated frostbite. Since our last attack to the south of the town, the veteran seemed to have regained his calm. The nervous excitement that affected all of us no longer seemed to touch him. He no longer took part in our desperate discussions and seemed to have separated himself from all our sufferings. The war, the cold, and all the other horrors which plagued us no longer seemed to touch him. His manner was strange, and we wondered about his frame of mind. However, that morning, his FM had saved us from a Russian patrol which had become particularly interested in our group. 20 Russian bodies lay stiffening in front of the Volkssturm truck, which continued to function despite the fact that one of its back wheels was a thick log wedged against the chassis, another of the minor miracles of Memel. Then the Russians had sent a 50mm bullet under its hood, finishing off the 2 old men dressed as soldiers who sat in the cab. Hours later, the damned thing was still blocking our view. The Russians had tried to use it as a shield to get close enough to wipe us out with grenades, but Wiener had riddled them with enough fire to finish them off too. Speed had been the critical factor, and Wiener had simply been the quickest. Now he sat in silence, wiping his gun as if it were a precious jewel. The rest of us, Hulls, Lindbergh, 2 others and I, remained sitting in nervous agitation behind our cold, grey weapons, fully aware that they were no longer enough to guarantee our safety. I had at my disposal 3 Panzerfausts and the new PM, which the Volkssturm had recently distributed, an extremely effective weapon which combined features of both the FM and the old PM. I also had a small magnetic mine, which gave my stomach an extra turn. At Memel, we each carried enough of an armoury to ensure a quick death. With all that load, there was no question of getting away quickly. We were to hold our position for about 2 more weeks, fighting off more or less soft attacks every 48 hours. Our rear was no great distance from the front, which made it possible for us to rotate our rest periods at reasonably frequent intervals, and rest in a manner that was more or less refreshing. Not far from us, beside what was left of the street, was a signpost stating that we were 5 miles from the coast, the last 5 miles of our retreat from the Don, an almost incredible sweep of over 1,000 miles, much of it on foot. As the veteran sometimes jokingly said to me, "The same route your great-grandfather took with Napoleon, my boy. You might think of it as a family affair, if that's any consolation to you." Then, one evening, as we were returning to the damp and icy cellar we used as a dormitory during our rest periods, we noticed that the civilian population of Memel had almost disappeared. The last shipload of refugees must have left while we were at the front. We walked through the darkness of the town, which was more like an abandoned cemetery than a town, and returned to our cellar with something like joy in our hearts. My companions sat huddled on their ragged pallets without talking, attacking whatever comestible Gransk had been able to produce, without even noticing what it was. It didn't matter a damn, their attention was elsewhere. They were dreaming in the heavy silence, fixing their eyes, which burned with accumulated distress, on the dirty grey vault of our cellar. They were dreaming of the deliverance which must be near at hand, of the leaking hulk which would carry us out onto the sea against which we had been pressed for so long. They were dreaming, staring from their dark sockets with mad, transparent eyes, and it was understood that no one would speak. Their eyes, which had grown used to staring only at the war, had turned toward the possibility of an inner vision it was just possible to glimpse, with an intensity which I also felt in myself. They were dreaming, and so that the war wouldn't catch them at it, they tried to hide it, looking at no one and keeping their eyes fixed on some inner vision of hope. I was the only one who saw them. I saw them because I had nothing else to see. I had already dreamed too much, and perhaps had lost that capacity. Too many of my dreams had been nightmares. Even if I had still been able to dream, I wouldn't have dared, because in the end, when one of the dreams came true, it was too painful. So I no longer dreamed, but watched the others, drinking in some of their hope, and turning it for moments at a time into concrete images. Worn boots on the slimy deck of a ship, boots, vomiting discoloured, empty uniforms. And then I would stop, because hope was so horrible. What forms did the hope of others take? It seemed that I no longer knew how to dream, and yet I too still possessed this impatience, which we hid and cherished like a treasure which life had not yet stolen. I still had it too, and was hiding it inside myself. I felt it and heard it, shrieking through my silence, shrieking so loudly that it overwhelmed me, like the noise of explosions. My balance was damaged by that sound, because I no longer dared lay claim to any particular hope or promise. I was afraid to ask too much, afraid that the least desire might seem like a demand. I was still alive, and was afraid that somebody might notice. I had given everything else I had, my feelings, my anguish, my sorrow, my fear. I had also forgotten Paula, and, so that I wouldn't still seem too rich, I had forgotten that I was too young. I was not in very good health, but everything at Memel was hard. People with holes in their stomachs as big as fists were asked to be brave. Others, whose blood was pouring out onto the snow, fired at the war until their eyes grew glassy. I was lucky. In spite of my fits of coughing and my bloody phlegm, I still had a spark of life, which I kept hidden. One must no longer ask anything of anybody. Even if God heard our prayers, whatever we received would be consumed. So I watched my companions as they dreamed. They too knew how dangerous dreams were in that place. Memel needed everything, dreams and hopes included. Men who still could hope fought better than those who couldn't. And we were all so tired of fighting. From time to time, one of us would emerge from torpor and scream. These screams were entirely involuntary. We couldn't stop them. They were produced by our exhaustion, by our organs writhing with fatigue. Some laughed as they howled, others prayed. Men who could pray could hope, and for so many hope was dead, so they howled their prayers. In any case, it was too late. Even if their prayers had been heard, God would no longer have dared to appear. He had abused his mercy, as in the case of Smellens, who had died that morning. Smellens had wanted to die, but not until he had received some news of his little brother, whom he had only seen twice. With dry eyes we had watched the road which should have brought us the post, but no news came. Smellens had hung on to life as long as he could, but here in Memel it was too late for the all-powerful. During the following days the first military evacuations took place. First, the units which had been most sorely tried, with the gravely wounded given priority, except for the hopeless cases, who would be as well off dying in Memel as anywhere else. The silently impatient joy of the less seriously injured, who could go, helped them to forget their wounds, which were tortured by the cold. Gangrenous cases stopped thinking about the amputations which awaited them. It was as if a veil of confidence had drifted gently over the town. Except for the planes, which hammered at us continuously, life might also have become life again. Ships gutted by bombs blocked the approaches to the piers. Mutilated corpses floated in the debris. The Navy was performing a prodigious task. We would have been lost without it. A barge packed with men had been bombed amidships by an adroit pilot who hit the bullseye the first time. We were summoned from our rest period to deal with the mess. I shall omit the details, the memory of which still nauseates me. Our boots were red with blood. The human refuse which we threw off the front of the half-submerged wreck drew a throng of fish, and the smell of bodies torn open by gaping wounds is beyond expression, even though the water washing over the carnage diminished it somewhat. The water in which we worked at first seemed warm in comparison to the air. After a short time, however, it began to seem like torture. Our gestures became slow and hesitant, and our hearts felt the wrenching of pain which clouded our vision. We had to hang on. 2 more ships were loading up with troops, and soon it would be our turn. By mid-morning the sky cleared. The pale sun attempting to shine over this scene of disaster filled us with unease. Any pleasure in the sun had long ago been killed for us. It invariably meant Russian planes. Before we had finished our clean-up, the Russian fighter bombers were overhead. This surprised no one. With good weather, it could only be expected. Limping on our painful feet, we ran as fast as we could for whatever shelter we could find. All the true concrete shelters were used as first aid hospitals or shelters for the wounded. We had to huddle in the ruins or in shell holes and bomb craters. We hid ourselves away in small clusters and tried to concentrate on our imminent escape. We could hear the anti-aircraft guns on all sides. Perhaps they would keep the planes away from the port itself. But then we heard planes flying low overhead, making the icy air around us vibrate with their passage. We watched them, rubbing our fingertips, which were numb with cold, as they passed over the ruined town, and the men in rows, bowing beneath them like grasses in a wind. They passed over 2 ships which cast off their moorings to make less of a target. 5 bombs fell simultaneously from the 5 planes gliding over the piers. 2 fell in the water, where they burst, covering the waiting men with spray. A third scattered debris on the beach, while the last 2 opened a crater in front of a line of men who would not be leaving until much later. Bodies flew into the air. Some of the survivors gave way to despair, but those who still dared to hope supported them. There were no cries, except from a few wounded men, who howled without meaning to. There were now some 40 planes overhead, and others were coming up from behind the cliffs to the north. One of them exploded in the air. Perhaps one of our guns had hit it. But there were no cries of triumph, as in the old days. Here there was only the noise of war. The men were silent. The ships had drawn somewhat away from the piers, but the men waiting to embark remained in their places so they wouldn't lose them. The planes turned in the sky, probably looking for the most effective positions for letting go their bombs. We watched, trembling with cold and despair. But no one questioned the sanity of the men who remained in line. We knew that, when our turn came, we would do the same thing. At that time and place, hope was worth everything, a fortune which there was no question of staking. Everyone there had invested everything their torments had spared them in the possibilities which those ships represented. The planes came over again, and I hid my eyes so that I couldn't see. The rhythm was too horrible, and in the end I was only human, not God. I hadn't died on the cross and had no right to watch.